The heat was already shimmering off the hard, packed earth when Adelaide Vance stumbled toward the well, her vision swimming with dark spots that refused to clear no matter how many times she blinked. The summer of 1873 had brought drought to Taylorsville, Texas, and with it, a merciless sun that seemed determined to bake every living thing until nothing remained but dust and bone. Adelaide's cotton dress clung to her back, soaked through with perspiration, and her hands trembled as she reached for the wooden bucket that sat beside the stone well. She had been working since dawn, helping her father repair the fence around their small property on the outskirts of town, and she had foolishly declined his offer of water nearly 2 hours ago. Pride was a terrible thing, she thought dimly, as the world tilted sideways and the bucket slipped from her fingers. The last thing she registered was the sound of hoofbeats approaching, and then the unforgiving ground rushing up to meet her, except it never did. Strong arms caught her mid-fall, cradling her against a chest that smelled of leather and sage, and a deep voice somewhere above her head called out words she could not quite make sense of through the roaring in her ears. The darkness pulled her under before she could see the face of her rescuer. When Adelaide opened her eyes again, she found herself lying on something soft, staring up at rough wooden beams that were not familiar. A cool cloth rested against her forehead, and somewhere nearby, she could hear the gentle splash of water being wrung from fabric. She tried to sit up, but a wave of dizziness forced her back down with a small gasp. "Easy there," came that same deep voice from before, and Adelaide turned her head to find a man kneeling beside the narrow bed where she lay. He was perhaps 25 or 26, with sun-darkened skin and hair the color of wheat that fell across his forehead in damp waves. His eyes were a startling gray-green, like moss growing on river stones, and they studied her with a mixture of concern and relief. "You gave me quite a scare, miss. Thought you might not wake up for a while there." "Where am I?" Adelaide's voice came out as barely more than a whisper, her throat dry as sandpaper despite the coolness of the cloth on her head. "My place, about a mile west of town. Name is Garrett Young. I was riding back from checking on some cattle when I saw you go down by that well." He reached for a tin cup that sat on a small table beside the bed and carefully lifted her head, helping her take small sips of water. "Drink slowly now. You were in a bad way when I found you." The water was the most wonderful thing Adelaide had ever tasted, cool and sweet, and she had to resist the urge to gulp it down. Garrett seemed to sense her desperation because he kept the cup just out of easy reach, doling out the liquid in measured amounts that would not make her sick. When she had finally had enough to ease the worst of her thirst, he set the cup aside and refreshed the cloth on her forehead with water from a basin. "Thank you," Adelaide managed, her voice already sounding stronger. "I was foolish. I should have taken water with me." "This heat makes fools of us all," Garrett replied with a slight smile that softened the angular lines of his face. "Been ranching in Texas my whole life, and I still sometimes forget how fast the sun can take you down if you are not careful. What is your name, if you do not mind my asking?" "Adelaide Vance. My father and I have the property just east of town, near the creek bed, or what used to be the creek bed before everything dried up." She managed to lift herself up on one elbow this time, looking around the small cabin with curious eyes. It was tidy and sparse, with little in the way of decorations save for a rifle mounted above the door and a few cooking implements hanging near a stone fireplace. "I should get back. He will be worried." "Already sent word," Garrett assured her, gently but firmly pressing her back down onto the bed. "Asked one of the Henderson boys to ride over and let your father know you were safe and resting. You are not going anywhere until you get your strength back, and that is final." There was something in his tone that brooked no argument, a quiet authority that Adelaide found both irritating and strangely comforting. She was not accustomed to being told what to do, having spent most of her 20 years helping her widowed father run their small ranch, and proving to everyone in Taylorsville that she was just as capable as any man when it came to hard work. Yet lying here in this stranger's cabin, still feeling as weak as a newborn calf, she had to admit that he was probably right. "How long was I unconscious?" she asked instead, settling back against the thin pillow with a sigh. "Near about an hour, maybe a bit more. Long enough for me to worry that I should fetch the doctor, though I figured getting you out of that sun was more important than speed." Garrett stood up, his tall frame unfolding with an easy grace that spoke of a lifetime spent in the saddle. He crossed to the fireplace and ladled something from a pot that hung over the low flames. "Made some broth earlier. You should try to get some down. It will help." Adelaide accepted the bowl he brought her, wrapping her hands around its warmth even though the cabin was far from cold. The broth was simple but good, flavored with wild onions and what tasted like rabbit, and she found herself eating more than she had expected. Garrett pulled up a rough-hewn chair and sat watching her with those unusual eyes, his expression thoughtful. "Your father, he manages the ranch alone aside from you?" he asked after a while. "Mother passed 5 years back. Fever took her in the winter of '68. Adelaide kept her voice steady, though even now the loss could catch her by surprise on particularly difficult days. "There is just the two of us now, working 10 acres and about 30 head of cattle. Not much compared to some of the spreads around here, but it is ours. 10 acres and 30 head is nothing to dismiss, especially with just 2 people working it," Garrett said with evident respect in his tone. "I have got 40 acres and about 80 head, but I also have got 2 hired hands who come up from Mexico every few months to help with the big jobs. Cannot imagine doing it with just one other person, especially someone who looks like a strong wind might carry her off." Adelaide bristled at that, setting down the now empty bowl with more force than necessary. "I am stronger than I look, Mr. Young. Today was an exception, not the rule." "Did not mean any offense." Garrett raised his hands in a gesture of peace, though his eyes held a glint of amusement. "Just stating facts as I see them. You are what, 5'3", 110 pounds soaking wet. That is not exactly built for wrangling cattle in 100-degree heat. And yet I have been doing exactly that for 5 years without collapsing once," Adelaide shot back, feeling her strength return along with her temper. "I do not need some cowboy I just met telling me what I am or am not capable of." "Fair enough," Garrett conceded, standing up and collecting her bowl. "Though maybe today should be a reminder that even the most capable among us need to take care of ourselves. No shame in that." Adelaide wanted to argue further, but she knew he was right, which only irritated her more. She watched as he moved about the cabin with easy efficiency, washing out the bowl and checking the water basin, his movements economical and sure. Despite her annoyance, she found herself noticing things about him, the way his worn cotton shirt stretched across broad shoulders, the faint scar that ran along his left forearm, the gentle way he handled everything despite having hands that were clearly accustomed to rough work. "How long have you been ranching out here?" she asked, more to distract herself from such observations than out of genuine curiosity, though once the question was asked, she found she actually did want to know. "Born on this land. My father claimed it back in '51, built this cabin with his own hands when I was just a baby. He and my mother both passed during the war, fever same as your mother, and I came back to find the place half wild and the cattle scattered to the 4 winds." Garrett returned to his chair, leaning back with his long legs stretched out in front of him. "Spent the last 8 years building it back up, though I am still a far cry from where my father had it. You fought in the war." Adelaide asked softly, understanding now the shadow that sometimes passed across his face. With Terry's Texas Rangers, such as they were by the end, was just 17 when I signed up, full of ideas about glory and honor. He gave a short, humorless laugh. "War has a way of burning that nonsense right out of you. Came home at 21 feeling like an old man." They sat in silence for a while, the weight of shared loss hanging between them. Adelaide had been only 12 when the war ended, too young to fully understand the scope of what had happened, but old enough to see how it changed the men who came back, her father included. He never spoke of his own service, and she had learned early not to ask. "I should really get home," she said eventually, though she made no move to rise. The truth was she still felt wrung out and shaky, but her pride would not let her admit it. "Sun is starting to lower now," Garrett observed, glancing toward the single window where golden afternoon light slanted through. "Give it another hour or so, let the worst of the heat pass, and I will ride back with you. Make sure you get home safe." "That is not necessary, maybe not, but I am doing it anyway." His tone was firm but not unkind. "You collapsed in front of me once today, Miss Vance. I would prefer not to have it happen again where there is no one around to catch you." Adelaide opened her mouth to protest, then closed it again. There was something in the way he looked at her, a concern that seemed to go beyond simple neighborly duty, that made her heart do a strange little flutter in her chest. She told herself it was just residual effects from the heat exhaustion, but some deeper part of her knew that was not quite true. The hour passed more quickly than Adelaide expected, filled with surprisingly easy conversation about ranching and the drought and the small dramas of Taylorsville life. Garrett turned out to have a dry sense of humor that caught her off guard, making her laugh more than once despite herself. By the time he declared the heat sufficiently diminished for travel, Adelaide found herself oddly reluctant to leave the dim coolness of his cabin. He saddled his horse, a rangy bay gelding with intelligent eyes, and helped Adelaide up behind him with hands careful and respectful. She had ridden double before, but never quite like this, with her arms wrapped around a stranger's waist and her cheek pressed against his broad back. She could feel the steady rhythm of his breathing, the warmth of him even through the cotton of his shirt, and something about it made her feel safer than she had in a long time. The ride back to her father's property took less time than she expected. Garrett kept the horse to an easy walk, occasionally glancing back to make sure she was holding up all right. As they crested the last rise before her home came into view, Adelaide saw her father pacing anxiously in front of the house, his weathered face creased with worry. "Papa," she called out as they approached, and Thomas Vance spun around with visible relief flooding his features. "Adelaide, thank the Lord," he said, reaching up to help her down from the horse even before Garrett could dismount. He wrapped her in a fierce hug, then held her at arm's length to look her over with searching eyes. "The Henderson boy said you had taken sick from the heat. Are you all right? Should I fetch Dr. Morrison?" "I am fine, Papa, truly. Just got foolish and did not drink enough water." Adelaide squeezed his hands reassuringly. "Mr. Young here found me and took care of me. I am perfectly fine now." Thomas turned his attention to Garrett, who had dismounted and stood holding his horse's reins with an easy stance. "Thomas Vance," he said, extending his hand. "Seems I owe you a considerable debt, Mr. Young." "Garrett, please," the younger man replied, shaking hands firmly. "And you owe me nothing. Anyone would have done the same." "Not everyone," Thomas said with a meaningful look. "And certainly not everyone would have taken the care you apparently did. The Henderson boy said you sent him right away so I would not worry, and it looks like you made sure my daughter was properly recovered before bringing her home. That speaks to character." Adelaide felt her cheeks warm at the praise being directed at Garrett, though whether from embarrassment or pleasure she could not quite say. Garrett himself looked somewhat uncomfortable with the gratitude, shifting his weight from one foot to the other in a way that reminded Adelaide of a schoolboy being complimented by a teacher. "Like I said, anyone would have done the same," he repeated, then looked at Adelaide with those gray-green eyes. "Though I hope you will remember to take better care of yourself from now on, Miss Vance. This heat is not something to take lightly." "I will remember," Adelaide promised, and meant it. "Well then, I should be getting back. Still got evening chores to see to." Garrett swung back up into the saddle with fluid grace, then touched the brim of his hat in a gesture of farewell. "Good evening to you both." "Wait," Thomas called out before Garrett could turn his horse. "We would be honored if you would join us for supper sometime soon. It is the least we can do to thank you properly." Garrett hesitated, and for a moment Adelaide thought he might refuse. Then his eyes flicked to her, holding her gaze for a heartbeat longer than was strictly necessary, and he nodded. "That would be very kind. Thank you." "Sunday next, if that suits," Thomas pressed. "After church services." "Sunday it is," Garrett agreed, and this time when he touched his hat brim, Adelaide was certain he was looking directly at her. Then he wheeled the bay around and rode off toward the setting sun, leaving Adelaide standing beside her father with a strange warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with the heat. "Seems like a good man," Thomas observed, watching Garrett's retreating form. "He was very kind," Adelaide agreed carefully, trying to keep her voice neutral. Thomas glanced at her with the knowing look that fathers sometimes have, but he said nothing more, simply draping an arm around her shoulders and guiding her into the house. Adelaide let him fuss over her, making her sit down and drink more water and eat the stew he had prepared for dinner, but her mind was elsewhere, replaying every moment of the afternoon in Garrett's cabin. She told herself it meant nothing, that she was simply grateful to him for helping her, but when she finally lay down to sleep that night, it was his gray-green eyes she saw in the darkness behind her closed eyelids. The days that followed were filled with work as they always were, but Adelaide found her thoughts drifting to Garrett Young with alarming frequency. She would be in the middle of mending fence or mucking out the small barn, and suddenly she would remember the way he had carefully measured out her water, or the gentle pressure of his hands helping her onto his horse, or the quiet authority in his voice when he insisted she rest. Each memory brought that same flutter to her chest, and she began to understand with a mixture of excitement and trepidation that what she felt was more than simple gratitude. Sunday arrived with the kind of bright, hot morning that promised another scorching day. Adelaide took extra care with her appearance, telling herself it was simply because they were having a guest and not because she wanted Garrett to see her in something other than a sweat-stained work dress. She chose her best Sunday dress, a pale blue cotton with white lace at the collar and cuffs that her mother had made years ago. It was a bit outdated in style, but still fit her well, and when she caught her reflection in the small mirror that hung in her room, she was pleased with what she saw. The church service seemed to drag on forever. Reverend Patterson's sermon about enduring hardship, feeling particularly long-winded in the stuffy heat of the small building. Adelaide tried to focus on the words, but her attention kept drifting to the window, watching the sun climb higher in the cloudless sky and wondering if Garrett would actually come or if he had simply been being polite when he accepted Thomas's invitation. Her fears were unfounded. When they arrived back home, Garrett was already there, sitting on his horse in the shade of the single cottonwood tree that grew near their house. He had cleaned up, Adelaide noticed, his hair still damp and combed back from his face, wearing what was clearly his own Sunday best shirt and a leather vest that looked newer than the rest of his clothes. He dismounted as they approached, and Adelaide's heart did that peculiar flutter again at the sight of him. "Hope I am not too early," Garrett said, greeting them with a slightly uncertain smile. Was not sure what time services let out. "Perfect timing," Thomas assured him, clapping him on the shoulder in the hearty way men do. "Come on in out of this heat. Adelaide has been cooking since dawn, and I can promise you it will be worth the wait." They settled around the small table in the main room, and Adelaide served the meal she had indeed spent most of the morning preparing. Roasted chicken that they could ill afford, but that her father had insisted upon, potatoes and carrots from their struggling garden, biscuits with precious butter and honey. It was the finest meal they had put together in months, and Adelaide felt a surge of pride when she saw Garrett's eyes widen appreciatively at the spread. The conversation flowed easily over the meal. Thomas and Garrett, discovering they had several mutual acquaintances and shared opinions about cattle breeding and water rights, and all the other concerns of ranching life. Adelaide contributed when appropriate, pleased to find that Garrett seemed genuinely interested in her thoughts on such matters, never once suggesting that they were beyond a woman's understanding the way some men did. "Adelaide has a real head for numbers," Thomas said at one point, his voice warm with fatherly pride. "Keeps all our books, manages our accounts with the bank and the feed store. I would be lost without her in that regard." "Never had much talent for figures myself," Garrett admitted. "I can manage well enough to keep from going under, but it does not come naturally. My father used to say I could read cattle like some men read books, but put actual books in front of me and I am slower than molasses." "Nothing wrong with that," Adelaide said. "Everyone has different strengths." "I imagine your talent with cattle is worth far more out here than being quick with arithmetic." "Kind of you to say," Garrett replied, and when their eyes met across the table, Adelaide felt heat rise to her cheeks that had nothing to do with the temperature. After the meal, Thomas suggested they sit outside where it was marginally cooler, and they arranged themselves in the shade of the cottonwood with cups of cool water drawn from the well. Adelaide could not help but notice that Garrett chose to sit near her rather than beside her father, close enough that she could have reached out and touched his arm if she had been bold enough to do so. "How are you feeling?" Garrett asked her quietly while Thomas was occupied refilling his pipe. "No lasting effects from your ordeal?" "None at all," Adelaide assured him. "And I have been much more careful about staying hydrated, I promise. You need not worry about finding me collapsed anywhere else." "Good," Garrett said, his expression serious. "Though I confess, I would not entirely mind having to rescue you again, if it meant getting to see you." The words hung in the air between them, and Adelaide felt her breath catch in her throat. This was not the kind of thing men said casually, not in her experience. This was the kind of thing that meant something, that suggested intentions beyond simple friendliness. "Is that so?" she managed, her voice coming out softer than she intended. "It is," Garrett confirmed, holding her gaze with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "I have been thinking about you quite a bit since last week, Adelaide. Hope that is not too forward of me to say." "Not too forward," Adelaide whispered, aware that her father could return at any moment, but unable to tear her attention away from Garrett's face. "I have been thinking about you as well." Whatever Garrett might have said next was interrupted by Thomas's return, but the look that passed between them spoke volumes. The rest of the afternoon took on a different quality after that. Every interaction charged with new meaning, every accidental brush of hands or meeting of eyes carrying weight. By the time Garrett finally took his leave as the sun began to sink toward the horizon, Adelaide felt as though something fundamental had shifted in her world. "May I call on you again?" Garrett asked as he prepared to mount his horse, speaking to Thomas but looking at Adelaide. "Not just for a meal, but to come courting, if that would be acceptable." Thomas looked to Adelaide, his expression neutral but his eyes questioning. This was her choice, his look said, and he would support whatever she decided. Adelaide took a breath. Thinking of all the reasons this might be complicated, a rancher and a rancher's daughter both barely scraping by, the difficulties of combining two struggling properties, the simple fact that she had only known this man for a week. Then she looked at Garrett's face, at the hope and nervousness written plainly there, and knew that none of those reasons mattered nearly as much as the way her heart leaped at the thought of seeing him again. "That would be very acceptable," she said, and was rewarded with a smile that transformed Garrett's entire face, making him look younger and lighter and absolutely radiant. "Then I will return tomorrow evening if that suits," Garrett said, directing this to Thomas. "After chores are done." "We will look forward to it," Thomas replied with a small smile of his own. Adelaide watched Garrett ride away into the gathering dusk, and only when he had disappeared from view did she turn to find her father watching her with knowing eyes. "He is a good man," Thomas said simply. "And unless I miss my guess, you are quite taken with him." "Is it that obvious?" Adelaide asked, feeling her cheeks warm. "To someone who knows you as well as I do, yes." Thomas put his arm around her shoulders, pulling her close in a brief hug. Your mother would have liked him, I think. He has kind eyes. The mention of her mother brought tears to Adelaide's eyes, though they were not entirely sad. I wish she was here, she whispered. So do I, sweetheart, so do I. Thomas was quiet for a moment, then added, but I think she would be happy to see you finding someone who looks at you the way that young man does. And how is that? Like you are the most precious thing he has ever seen. True to his word, Garrett returned the next evening and the evening after that, and the one after that. Within a week, his visits had become a regular part of their routine, as natural as the setting of the sun. He would arrive after finishing his own chores, sometimes bringing small gifts, a haunch of venison from a deer he had shot, or wildflowers he had found growing in some hidden pocket of moisture, or once, a book of poetry that had belonged to his mother. Adelaide treasured that last gift especially, touched by the intimacy of being trusted with something so personal. They would sit together in the cooling evening air, talking about everything and nothing, their conversations ranging from the practical concerns of ranching to their dreams for the future to stories from their childhoods. Garrett proved to be a patient listener and a thoughtful speaker, never dismissing her opinions or talking over her the way some men did. He asked about her mother and shared memories of his own parents, creating a foundation of mutual understanding and respect that went deeper than simple attraction. Not that the attraction was not there. Adelaide felt it every time Garrett smiled at her, every time their fingers brushed in passing, every time she caught him watching her with those gray-green eyes that seemed to see straight into her soul. She found herself noticing details about him that she had missed before, the way his hair curled slightly at the nape of his neck, the small crinkles that appeared at the corners of his eyes when he laughed, the careful gentleness of his hands despite their obvious strength. 3 weeks after Garrett began courting her, he asked if she would like to see his ranch. Adelaide agreed eagerly, curious to see where and how he lived, and they set out early one morning when the air was still relatively cool. Thomas stayed behind to manage their own chores, giving them a knowing look as they departed that made Adelaide blush. The ride to Garrett's property took about 40 minutes, and Adelaide found herself enjoying the journey almost as much as the destination. Garrett kept his horse to an easy pace, pointing out various landmarks and telling her stories about the land. He showed her where he had found her that day by the well, and Adelaide felt a strange swoop in her stomach at the realization that if he had taken a different route, if he had been even a few minutes later, things might have turned out very differently. Do you believe in fate? She asked impulsively. Garrett considered the question seriously. I do not know if I believe everything is predetermined, he said slowly, but I do think sometimes things happen the way they are meant to, like me finding you that day. If I had to live through the war and lose my parents and spend 8 years rebuilding this ranch all alone, well, maybe it was all leading to that moment by the well. Maybe it all had to happen exactly that way, so I would be in exactly the right place to find you. That is a beautiful way to look at it, Adelaide said softly, her arms tightening around his waist. When they arrived at Garrett's property, Adelaide was impressed by what she saw. The ranch was larger than her father's, the cabin more substantial, with a proper barn and several corrals that spoke of careful planning and hard work. The land itself was in better condition too, benefiting from a slightly different drainage pattern that had left it less devastated by the drought. Garrett showed her around with obvious pride, introducing her to his 2 hired hands, a pair of brothers from Monterey named Carlos and Miguel, who greeted her with respectful nods and knowing grins. The boss, he talks about you all the time, Carlos confided when Garrett was briefly out of earshot, his English heavily accented but perfectly clear. Adelaide this, Adelaide that. We were beginning to think you were just a dream he made up. Carlos, that is enough, Garrett called out, returning in time to hear the last part. He looked mortified, but Adelaide just laughed, charmed by the idea of Garrett talking about her when she was not there. They spent the afternoon touring the property, Garrett explaining his plans for expansion and improvement with an enthusiasm that Adelaide found infectious. He had ideas, good ones, about water conservation and breeding programs and crop rotation that could supplement the cattle income. Listening to him, Adelaide could see how he had taken a neglected property and slowly, but surely turned it into something viable and even prosperous. "You have done remarkable work here," she told him as they stood looking out over his land from a slight rise. "Your father would be proud." "I hope so," Garrett said quietly. "I think about him sometimes, about what he would say about all this, about you." "What do you think he would say about me?" Garrett turned to face her, reaching out to take her hand in his. It was the first time he had done more than briefly touch her arm or shoulder, and Adelaide felt the warmth of his palm against hers like a brand. "I think he would say, 'I was the luckiest man in Texas,'" Garrett said simply. "And I think he would be right." "Garrett," Adelaide breathed, not sure what else to say, her heart hammering so hard she was certain he must be able to hear it. "I know we have not been courting long," Garrett continued, his thumb tracing gentle circles on the back of her hand. "And I know I should probably wait longer before saying this. But I am not a man who hides what I am feeling, Adelaide, and what I am feeling is that I am half in love with you already. Maybe more than half, and I needed you to know that." Adelaide stared up at him, at this man who had carried her when she fell and who had been steady and true ever since, and felt something inside her chest crack open like a flower in bloom. "Only half?" she asked, and was pleased when he laughed, the sound rich and warm. "All right, more than half," he admitted. "Significantly more." "Good," Adelaide said, stepping closer until she could feel the heat radiating from him in the afternoon sun. "Because I am falling in love with you too, Garrett Young, and it terrifies me how fast it is happening." "Me too," Garrett confessed. "But it is the best kind of terrifying, is it not?" "Yes," Adelaide agreed. "Yes, it is." They stood there for a long moment, hands clasped, looking into each other's eyes while the Texas sun beat down around them and the future stretched out full of possibility. Then Garrett raised her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles, a gesture so tender and old-fashioned that Adelaide felt tears prick at her eyes. "Come on," Garrett said eventually, his voice slightly rough. "Let me show you the garden. My mother planted it 20 years ago, and somehow it keeps coming back every spring no matter how much I neglect it. Think maybe you could give me some advice on how to care for it properly." They spent the rest of the afternoon in companionable domesticity, Adelaide offering suggestions for the garden and the interior of the cabin, which clearly needed a woman's touch. Garrett listened to all her ideas with genuine interest, already making plans for improvements, and Adelaide felt a warm sense of belonging that had nothing to do with the heat. By the time Garrett rode her back home as the sun was setting, Adelaide knew with absolute certainty that she wanted to spend her life with this man. It was fast, perhaps too fast by society's standards, but out here in Texas, where life was hard and uncertain, people learned to recognize the real thing when they found it and hold on tight. Over the following weeks, their courtship deepened and intensified. Garrett came to the Vance property almost daily now, helping with heavier chores and gradually becoming an indispensable part of their operation. Thomas watched this development with approval, coming to rely on the younger man's strength and expertise, while also seeing how happy he made Adelaide. The three of them fell into an easy rhythm, working together during the day and sharing meals in the evening, gradually becoming less like two separate families and more like one unit. One evening in early September, when the worst of the summer heat had finally started to break, Garrett asked Thomas if he could speak with him privately. Adelaide watched them walk off together, her heart in her throat, because she knew what this conversation had to be about. She tried to busy herself with cleaning up from supper, but her hands shook as she washed the dishes, and she kept straining her ears to hear what was being said, even though she knew they had gone too far for her to catch any words. When they returned 20 minutes later, Thomas's eyes were suspiciously bright, and Garrett looked nervous but hopeful. Her father excused himself, claiming he needed to check on something in the barn, leaving Adelaide and Garrett alone in the gathering dusk. "Adelaide," Garrett began, then stopped, running a hand through his hair in an uncharacteristically nervous gesture. "I spoke with your father." "I gathered that," Adelaide said, her own nervousness making her voice come out sharper than she intended. "What did you speak about?" "You," Garrett said simply. He reached out and took both her hands in his, holding them firmly. "Adelaide Vance, I know we have only been courting for 2 months. I know by all rights I should wait longer, be more patient. But I have spent the last 8 years alone, and now that I have found you, I cannot bear the thought of spending another day not knowing you will be by my side. I love you. I love your strength and your stubbornness and your quick mind and your kind heart. I love the way you laugh and the way you are not afraid of hard work and the way you look at me like I am someone worth looking at. And I am asking if you would do me the incredible honor of becoming my wife." Adelaide felt tears spill over and run down her cheeks, but she was smiling so wide her face hurt. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking on the word. "Yes, Garrett, of course yes." Garrett let out a breath that sounded like he had been holding it for hours, then pulled her into his arms, holding her tight against his chest. Adelaide could hear his heart pounding beneath her ear, fast and hard, matching her own racing pulse. They stood like that for a long moment, just holding each other in the fading light, and Adelaide thought she had never felt so safe and so happy and so completely right in her entire life. "I do not have a ring yet," Garrett said eventually, pulling back just enough to look down at her face. "But I will get you one, I promise, the nicest one I can afford." "I do not need a ring," Adelaide told him, though her heart warmed at the thought. "I just need you. You have me," Garrett promised, "for as long as you want me. Forever then, forever it is." Thomas returned from the barn wearing a smile that suggested he had not actually been doing anything except giving them privacy, and they shared the news officially, though it was hardly a surprise. Her father embraced them both, his eyes bright with emotion. "Your mother would have loved him," Thomas told Adelaide, echoing his words from weeks ago, "and she would have been so happy to see you this happy." "I wish she could be here," Adelaide said, allowing herself a moment of grief in the midst of her joy. "She is," Thomas said firmly. "Maybe not in the way we would like, but she is here. I feel certain of it." They set the wedding for late October, wanting to wait until the weather cooled further but not wanting to wait too long. The Reverend Patterson agreed to perform the ceremony, and the whole town of Taylorsville buzzed with the news. Apparently, Adelaide and Garrett's courtship had been the subject of considerable gossip and speculation, and most folks seemed pleased to see it ending in marriage. The weeks leading up to the wedding passed in a blur of preparation. Adelaide worked on altering her mother's wedding dress to fit her, the ivory silk still beautiful despite its age. Garrett spent his evenings building furniture for the cabin they would share, his own place being larger and in better condition than her father's property. The plan was for Adelaide to move to Garrett's ranch after the wedding, while Thomas would continue managing his own land with the help of a hired man. They would split the cost of employing. Adelaide felt a pang at the thought of leaving her childhood home, but it was overshadowed by excitement for the future. She and Garrett spent hours planning how they would combine their operations, pool their resources, and work together to build something stronger than either property could be alone. Garrett insisted that Adelaide should maintain ownership of her father's land in her own name, showing a respect for her independence that made her love him even more. The night before the wedding, Adelaide lay in her childhood bed for the last time, staring up at the ceiling and thinking about everything that had changed in the past 3 months. If someone had told her in June that she would be married by October to a man she had only just met, she would have laughed at the absurdity of it. Yet here she was, and the only absurd thing was how right it all felt. The wedding day dawned clear and beautiful, the October air crisp and cool after the brutal summer. Adelaide dressed with trembling hands, her father helping her with the buttons on the back of her mother's dress that she could not reach. When she looked in the mirror, she saw her mother's face in her own reflection, the same dark hair and blue eyes, and felt a sense of connection that took her breath away. "You look just like her," Thomas said softly, confirming what Adelaide had been thinking. "She would be so proud of the woman you have become." The ceremony took place in the small church, packed with what seemed like everyone from Taylorsville and the surrounding ranches. Adelaide walked down the aisle on her father's arm, but her eyes were only for Garrett, who stood at the front in a new suit that must have cost him dearly. The look on his face as he watched her approach was worth more than any words, pure love and awe and joy written plainly for everyone to see. Reverend Patterson kept the service short and sweet, sensing perhaps that both bride and groom were too overwhelmed with emotion for lengthy speeches. When he pronounced them husband and wife and told Garrett he could kiss his bride, Adelaide felt like her heart might burst from happiness as Garrett cupped her face in his hands and kissed her with tender reverence, the whole church erupting in applause around them. The celebration afterward took place at the town hall, with tables laden with food that the community had contributed, and a fiddler who had come all the way from Austin to provide music. Adelaide danced first with Garrett, then with her father, then with what seemed like every man in town, while Garrett good-naturedly cut in whenever he felt she had been away from him too long. As the sun set and the party showed no signs of slowing down, Garrett pulled Adelaide aside and whispered, "What do you say we slip away? Start our married life proper?" Adelaide needed no further encouragement. They made their goodbyes to Thomas, who hugged them both fiercely, then managed to extract themselves from the celebration and ride back to Garrett's ranch, their ranch now. The cabin was dark when they arrived, but Garrett had left lanterns ready to light, and soon the interior glowed with warm golden light. "Welcome home, Mrs. Young," Garrett said, and Adelaide loved the way her new name sounded in his voice. "It feels like home already," she replied truthfully. "It has felt like home since the first time you brought me here." Garrett smiled and pulled her close, and Adelaide went willingly into his arms, ready to begin their life together in truth. The night that followed was tender and passionate, and everything Adelaide had hoped for. Two people learning each other and claiming each other, making promises with their bodies that echoed the ones they had spoken before God and the community earlier that day. The months that followed were not without challenges. Combining two ranching operations proved complicated, with constant decisions to be made about resource allocation and labor distribution. Money was tight, especially after the expenses of the wedding, and there were times when Adelaide lay awake worrying about whether they would make it through to spring. But through it all, Garrett was beside her, a steady presence and an equal partner, valuing her input and trusting her judgment in a way that made all the difficulties bearable. They fell into a rhythm, rising before dawn to work the land and the cattle, often not stopping until well past dark. It was exhausting work, but Adelaide found she did not mind, not when she could look up from whatever task she was doing and see Garrett nearby. Not when they could share meals and conversation and a bed at the end of each long day. Her father came over regularly to help with bigger projects, and Carlos and Miguel proved to be good-humored and hard-working employees who quickly became friends. Winter came, milder than some, but still cold enough to test them. One particularly bitter night in January, a storm blew in with little warning, bringing driving rain that quickly turned to sleet. Adelaide and Garrett worked frantically to get the cattle into shelter, both of them soaked to the skin and half frozen by the time they finally stumbled back into the cabin hours after dark. "Get those wet things off," Garrett ordered through chattering teeth, already stripping off his own sodden clothes. Adelaide complied, her fingers so numb she could barely manage the buttons. They huddled together in front of the fireplace, wrapped in blankets, sharing body heat until the shivering finally subsided. Some married life I have given you, Garrett said ruefully. Freezing to death while trying to save cattle in a sleet storm. It is exactly the life I signed up for, Adelaide replied, snuggling closer. I knew what ranching meant when I married you, Garrett. I'm not afraid of hard work or bad weather or any of it, as long as we are facing it together. Together, Garrett echoed, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. I like the sound of that. Spring arrived eventually, bringing with it new life and new hope. The winter had been hard on their herds, but they had not lost as many cattle as some of their neighbors, and the few calves that were born healthy and strong. Adelaide threw herself into planting an expanded garden, using seeds she had carefully saved and traded for, determined to make them as self-sufficient as possible. It was while she was working in that garden on a warm April morning, her hands deep in the rich earth, that Adelaide first suspected she might be carrying a child. She had been feeling off for several weeks, tired in a way that went beyond the usual exhaustion of ranch work, and there were other signs that she had been trying not to notice. But kneeling there in the dirt with the sun on her back, she suddenly knew with absolute certainty that a new life was growing inside her. She said nothing to Garrett at first, wanting to be completely sure before she shared the news. But as days turned into weeks and her suspicions strengthened into certainty, she found it harder and harder to keep the secret. Finally, one evening in early May, she decided it was time. They were sitting on the porch after supper, watching the sun set in brilliant streaks of orange and pink, when Adelaide reached over and took Garrett's hand. I have something to tell you, she said, her voice trembling slightly with nerves and excitement. What is it? Garrett asked, immediately attentive to her tone. I am with child, Adelaide said simply, watching his face for his reaction. We are going to have a baby. For a moment, Garrett just stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then his face broke into the widest smile Adelaide had ever seen, pure joy radiating from him like sunlight. Truly, he asked, his voice rough with emotion. We are going to be parents. Truly, Adelaide confirmed, and then she was in his arms, Garrett holding her like she was made of glass, his face buried in her hair. A baby, he kept repeating, wonder in his voice. We are going to have a baby. Are you happy? Adelaide asked, even though she could feel the answer in every line of his body. Happy does not begin to cover it, Garrett said, pulling back to look at her face, his eyes bright with unshed tears. You have given me so much, Adelaide. A home, a partner, a future, and now this. I do not have words for what I am feeling right now. Then do not use words, Adelaide suggested, and Garrett kissed her, soft and reverent, like she was something precious beyond measure. The pregnancy progressed normally, though Adelaide found the Texas summer heat even more oppressive while carrying the extra weight. Garrett became even more protective than usual, trying to take on extra work to spare her, but Adelaide would have none of it. She continued working right alongside him, knowing that they could not afford for her to take it easy, though she did accept his help with the heavier tasks. Thomas was beside himself with joy at the prospect of becoming a grandfather, coming over even more frequently to help out and fuss over Adelaide. The whole community seemed invested in the pregnancy, with the women of Taylorsville offering advice both solicited and otherwise, and gifts of baby clothes and blankets that touched Adelaide deeply. As summer gave way to fall, and her time drew near, Adelaide found herself thinking often of her mother, wishing with an ache that never quite faded that she could be there for this moment. She wondered if she would have her mother's dark hair and blue eyes, or Garrett's wheat-colored hair and gray-green eyes, or some combination of the two. She wondered what kind of mother she would be, whether she would have her mother's gentle patience or would fumble her way through, learning as she went. The baby came on a crisp November morning, a year and a day after Adelaide and Garrett had married. The labor was long and difficult, attended by the doctor and 2 experienced midwives from town, with Garrett wearing a path in the floorboards from his pacing in the next room. But when Dr. Morrison finally emerged to tell him he had a healthy son and a wife who was tired but fine, Garrett's knees nearly buckled with relief. They named him Thomas Samuel Young, honoring Adelaide's father and Garrett's own father. The baby had a shock of dark hair like Adelaide's and his father's distinctive gray-green eyes. And from the moment Garrett held him for the first time, Adelaide knew that her husband was completely besotted. "He is perfect," Garrett whispered, staring down at the tiny bundle in his arms with wonder. "You are amazing, Adelaide, absolutely amazing." Adelaide, exhausted but happier than she could remember being, smiled up at her husband and their son and felt her heart swell with love so fierce it was almost painful. This was her family, the one she and Garrett had built together from nothing but hope and hard work, and a chance meeting by a well on a burning summer day. Thomas Sr. wept openly when he first held his grandson, and Adelaide wept with him, the two of them sharing a moment of grief and joy intertwined, mourning the woman who was not there to see this, but celebrating the new life that carried on her legacy. The early days of parenthood were exhausting and overwhelming and absolutely wonderful. Little Thomas, or Tommy as they quickly began calling him, was a good baby for the most part, though he had a powerful set of lungs when he wanted something. Garrett proved to be a natural father, patient and gentle with the baby even after long days of ranch work, often walking the cabin floor for hours at night when Tommy was fussy so that Adelaide could rest. "I never knew I could love someone this much," Garrett confessed one night, holding Tommy while the baby slept peacefully in his arms. "I thought what I felt for you was the biggest thing my heart could hold, but somehow there is room for this too." "The heart is amazing that way," Adelaide replied softly. "It just keeps expanding to hold whatever love we pour into it." As Tommy grew from newborn to infant, life settled into a new normal. Adelaide learned to manage ranch work with a baby, often strapping Tommy to her back while she worked in the garden or did lighter chores. Garrett built a cradle that he set up in the barn so Tommy could be nearby, even when they were working with the cattle. It was not easy, but they made it work, the way they made everything work, through teamwork and determination and love. The years passed, measured in seasons and harvests and the milestones of Tommy's growth. First smile, first laugh, first tooth, first steps. The ranch prospered slowly but surely, their combined efforts and careful management gradually paying off. They were never wealthy, but they were comfortable, which was more than many could say. When Tommy was 3, Adelaide found herself pregnant again. This time the pregnancy was easier, her body knowing what to expect, and she delivered a healthy daughter on a summer evening when fireflies danced outside the windows. They named her Sarah Grace, after Garrett's mother and the grace they both felt had brought them together. Sarah had her father's wheat-colored hair and her mother's blue eyes, and a smile that could light up a room. Tommy was fascinated by his baby sister, wanting to help with everything, and Adelaide's heart swelled watching Garrett teach their son how to be gentle, how to support the baby's head, how to love and protect. More years passed, full and rich despite their hardships. Tommy grew into a bright, curious boy who loved the ranch and the cattle, following his father everywhere with eager questions. Sarah proved to be a wild child, fearless and adventurous, keeping them all on their toes. When Sarah was 2, Adelaide delivered their third child, a son they named William, who was calm and thoughtful from the very beginning, content to watch and observe where his siblings were more active. Thomas Sr. remained a fixture in their lives, doting on his grandchildren and helping out around the ranch even as age began to slow him down. In the spring of 1882, he peacefully passed away in his sleep, and though they mourned him, there was comfort in knowing he had lived to see Adelaide happy and settled with a family of her own. Life was not without its challenges and sorrows. There were droughts and harsh winters, sick cattle and failed crops, the constant worry about money, and whether they would make it through another year. There were disagreements between Adelaide and Garrett, though they learned to work through them with patience and communication. There were sleepless nights with sick children and accidents that stopped Adelaide's heart with fear until she knew everyone was safe. But through it all, Adelaide and Garrett remained each other's constant, the foundation upon which everything else was built. They still sat together on the porch in the evenings when they could steal the time, still held hands when they walked, still looked at each other with the same love that had sparked into life that day by the well. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Garrett surprised Adelaide with a gift, a beautiful quilt that he had commissioned from the women of the church, made from scraps of fabric that represented different moments in their life together. There was pale blue from Adelaide's mother's wedding dress, gray-green like Garrett's eyes, darker blue for Tommy's baby blanket, yellow for Sarah's first dress, soft white for William's christening gown. "So you never forget," Garrett said as Adelaide ran her fingers over the careful stitching, tears streaming down her face. "How amazing our life has been. Every piece of it, even the hard parts, because they all led us here to this moment with our family and our home and each other." "As if I could ever forget," Adelaide whispered, pulling him into a kiss that still made her heart race after all these years. "You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Garrett Young." "Second best," Garrett corrected with a grin, nodding toward where their children were playing in the yard. "Those three are pretty wonderful, too." "We did good work there," Adelaide agreed, watching Tommy help Sarah climb a tree while William looked on with his thoughtful gaze. "We did good work everywhere," Garrett said, wrapping his arms around her from behind and resting his chin on top of her head. "Look at this place, Adelaide. Look at what we built together." Adelaide looked, really looked, at the ranch spread out before them. The cabin had been expanded twice now, with proper additions for the children and a parlor where they could gather as a family. The barn was larger and sturdier, the corrals in good repair, the fields productive. The herd had grown to over 150 head of cattle, healthy and well managed. It was everything they had worked for and more. Not bad for a cowboy and a girl who collapsed at a well, Adelaide mused. "That girl is the strongest woman I know," Garrett said, pressing a kiss to her temple. "And that cowboy will never let her go." "Promise, promise," Garrett confirmed. "I carried you that day, Adelaide, and in a way I have never stopped carrying you. Just like you have carried me through all the hard times, that is what we do. We carry each other." As the sun set over their land, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Adelaide leaned back against her husband's chest and thought about how differently her life could have turned out. If she had not pushed herself too hard that summer day, if Garrett had taken a different route. If she had been too proud to accept help, or he too busy to offer it. So many tiny moments and choices that had led to this, to a life richer and fuller than she had ever imagined possible. The children ran up then, Tommy and Sarah arguing good-naturedly about something while William toddled behind, and Adelaide and Garrett turned their attention to the beautiful chaos of family life. They ushered everyone inside for supper, the cabin filling with warmth and laughter and love. Years continued to pass, bringing more changes and challenges and joys. The children grew, eventually leaving to start their own lives but always remaining close, drawn back to the ranch and the parents who had built something lasting through love and hard work. Tommy took over much of the ranch operation as Garrett's hair turned silver and his joints grew stiff with age. Sarah married a good man from Austin and gave them grandchildren who spent summers running wild on the land. William became a teacher, bringing his own children back regularly to visit and tell their grandparents about life in town. Adelaide and Garrett grew old together, their love deepening and mellowing with time but never fading. They still sat on the porch in the evenings, now in rocking chairs that Tommy had built for them, holding hands and watching the sunset just as they had done for decades. Adelaide's dark hair had gone silver, and Garrett's broad shoulders were not quite as broad anymore, but when they looked at each other, they still saw the young people who had fallen in love over a summer 3 decades past. On a warm evening in June of 1905, Adelaide and Garrett sat together on their porch, surrounded by children and grandchildren who had gathered for a family celebration. Tommy had successfully closed a deal to expand their cattle operation, partnering with a rancher in the next county, and everyone had come to celebrate the achievement. As Adelaide watched her family, 3 generations now spread across the yard and spilling out of the cabin, she felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude for the life she had lived. It had not been easy, but it had been hers, built through choice and love and dedication alongside the man who still held her hand like it was the most natural thing in the world. "What are you thinking about?" Garrett asked softly, his aged voice still carrying the warmth that had drawn her to him all those years ago. "Everything," Adelaide replied honestly. "That day at the well, you carrying me, every moment since then. How lucky I was that you rode past when you did." "I was the lucky one," Garrett insisted, as he always did when this conversation came up. "Finding you lying there, getting to be the one who helped you, who got to know you and love you, that was the greatest gift of my life." "We were both lucky," Adelaide compromised, leaning her head against his shoulder. "Lucky to find each other, lucky to build this life, lucky to still be here together, seeing what our love created." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching as Sarah helped her own daughter learn to rope a post, as Tommy explained something about cattle breeding to his oldest son, as William read a story to a cluster of younger grandchildren. The sun set in brilliant colors, and the stars began to emerge one by one in the darkening sky. "Do you remember what I said to you that first day?" Garrett asked eventually. "When you woke up in my cabin, you told me to drink slowly," Adelaide recalled with a small smile. "That I was in a bad way when you found me. Before that, I said you gave me quite a scare." Garrett squeezed her hand gently. "What I did not say, what I could not say then, was that the moment I saw you falling, the moment I caught you, something in my chest shifted. Like a door I had not known was closed, suddenly swinging open. I knew right then, even though you were a stranger, that you were going to change my life." "Did I?" Adelaide asked, though she knew the answer. "You changed everything," Garrett confirmed, his voice thick with emotion. "You took a lonely cowboy who was just going through the motions and gave him a reason to live instead of just survive. You gave me love and family and purpose. You made this ranch into a home. You made me into the man I always wanted to be, but did not know how to become alone." "We did that together," Adelaide insisted, tilting her head to look up at his face, still handsome to her despite the lines and the silver hair. "Every step of the way, we did it together." "Together," Garrett agreed and kissed her softly, the same way he had kissed her 10,000 times before and would, God willing, kiss her 10,000 times more. As night fell completely and their family gradually moved inside, Adelaide and Garrett remained on the porch a while longer, reluctant to end the perfect evening. The sounds of laughter and conversation drifted out through the open windows, the next generation already making memories in the home Adelaide and Garrett had built with their own hands. No regrets. Garrett asked, a question he posed sometimes even now, always wanting to make sure she was happy with the life they had chosen. "Not a single one," Adelaide assured him, and it was the absolute truth. "Well, maybe one small regret." "What is that?" "That I only got to fall in love with you once," she said with a mischievous smile. "It was so wonderful, I would not mind doing it again." Garrett laughed, the sound warming Adelaide's heart just as it always had. "I fall in love with you every single day," he told her. "Every morning when I wake up and see you beside me, every time you smile, every time I watch you with our children and grandchildren, it is not the same as that first falling, but it is just as powerful." "That is beautiful," Adelaide whispered, her eyes stinging with happy tears. "That is true," Garrett corrected. "Every word of it." They finally went inside as the air grew cool, joining their family in the warmth and light of the cabin. The evening stretched on with stories and songs and the comfortable chaos of a family that loved each other deeply. Adelaide moved through it all with Garrett beside her, the two of them still in perfect sync after all these years, still able to communicate with just a look or a touch. When the last guest had finally departed and the house grew quiet, Adelaide and Garrett prepared for bed with the easy routine of decades. As Adelaide brushed out her long silver hair, watching Garrett's reflection in the mirror as he banked the fire in the bedroom hearth, she thought about how ordinary this moment was and how extraordinary that ordinariness had become. This was not the stuff of grand romance novels, no dramatic gestures or sweeping declarations. Just two people who had chosen each other and kept choosing each other every single day through everything life had thrown at them. "Come to bed," Garrett said softly, already under the quilts, and Adelaide went willingly, settling into the space beside him that felt like it had been made precisely for her. He wrapped his arms around her, and she pressed her back against his chest, fitting together like two pieces of a puzzle. "I love you," Adelaide whispered into the darkness. "I love you too," Garrett replied, his breath warm against her neck. "From that day at the well until my last breath and beyond." "Beyond," Adelaide echoed, liking the sound of that word and all it implied. They drifted off to sleep wrapped in each other's arms, content and peaceful, knowing that whatever tomorrow brought, they would face it the same way they had faced everything for the past 32 years, together, with love and determination and faith in what they had built. The story of Adelaide and Garrett Young became something of a legend in Taylorsville over the years, the tale of the cowboy who caught the falling girl and never let her go, transformed by telling and retelling into something almost mythical. But those who knew them, who saw them together at church on Sundays, or working their land or sitting on their porch in the evening, knew that the real story was even better than the legend. Because the real story was not about a single dramatic moment, but about the 1,000 small moments that followed, the daily choice to love and support and build together, the unglamorous work of making a life and a family and a legacy. As the years rolled on into the new century, Adelaide and Garrett remained fixtures in the community, respected elders, whose marriage was held up as an example of what partnership should look like. They slowed down as age demanded, eventually turning over most of the ranch work to Tommy and his wife, but they never stopped being interested in life, in their family, in each other. On a spring morning in 1912, Adelaide woke to find Garrett already up and sitting by the window, looking out over the land they had worked together for nearly 40 years. She rose and went to join him, settling into his lap like she had done 1,000 times before, resting her head against his shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, echoing the question he had asked her so many times over the years. "How good it has been," Garrett replied simply. "All of it, even the hard parts, maybe especially the hard parts because they made us stronger." "We were always strong," Adelaide said. "We just had to find each other to realize it." "Finding each other was the easy part," Garrett mused. "You collapsed and I caught you, simple as that." The hard part, the important part, was everything that came after. Choosing to stay caught, choosing to hold on even when it would have been easier to let go. "I never wanted to let go," Adelaide told him. "Not for a single moment." "Neither did I," Garrett assured her, "and I never will." They sat together in the growing light, watching the sun rise over their land, over the life they had built. And Adelaide knew with the certainty that comes from a lifetime of experience that she was exactly where she was meant to be. Not because of fate or destiny or anything so grand, but because of choice, her choice and Garrett's choice, made every day for nearly 40 years and counting. Their remaining years together were gentle and sweet, marked by quiet joys and the comfort of deep familiarity. They watched their grandchildren grow and begin families of their own, saw the ranch continue to prosper under Tommy's capable management, took pride in Sarah's growing family and William's successful career. They held each other through illness and grief, celebrated birthdays and anniversaries, and never took for granted the gift of growing old together. When Garrett passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 73, Adelaide felt like half her soul had been torn away. But even in her grief, she found comfort in the legacy they had created together, in the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who carried their love forward, in the ranch that stood as testament to what two people could build when they committed themselves to each other fully and completely. Adelaide lived another 5 years after Garrett's death, staying on the ranch that had been her home for so long, surrounded by family who loved her and told her often how grateful they were for the example she and Garrett had set. On quiet evenings, she would sit on the porch in her rocking chair, and sometimes she could almost feel Garrett's presence beside her, his hand in hers, his voice soft in her ear. When Adelaide finally passed away on a warm June evening, with her children holding her hands and the windows open to let in the scent of the flowers she had planted so many years before, her last words were simple and clear. "Take me to the well." Her family understood. They laid her to rest beside Garrett in the small cemetery on the edge of town, not far from the old well where their story had begun. The headstone they chose bore both their names, the dates of their births and deaths, and a simple inscription that Tommy had suggested. He carried her and never let go. And indeed, he never had, not in life and not in death, their love story woven into the very fabric of the land they had worked, the family they had raised, the community they had served. Every sunset over the ranch, every wildflower growing where Adelaide had planted them, every grandchild who learned to ride on the same land where their grandparents had built their life, was a testament to what began on a hot summer day in 1873, when a cowboy caught a falling girl and changed both their destinies forever. The well still stood, though it was not used anymore, modern pumps having long since replaced the old bucket and rope. But it remained there as a marker, a reminder, a sacred spot in family lore. Adelaide and Garrett's great-great-grandchildren would sometimes make pilgrimages there, standing in the spot where it all began and trying to imagine what it must have been like, that moment when everything changed. But they could never truly capture it, because the magic was not in the single moment, but in the lifetime that followed, in the choice to build something lasting from a chance encounter, in the daily renewal of love and commitment that turned a dramatic rescue into a beautiful forever. That was the real story, not of a cowboy who saved a girl, but of two people who saved each other, over and over, in ways both big and small, until their individual lives became so intertwined they were inseparable. And so the story ended not with death, but with legacy, with love that transcended mortality and touched generation after generation, all tracing their beginnings back to a hot summer day, a well and two people brave enough to hold on and never let go. It was a good story, a true story, and more importantly, it was a love story, the kind that reminds us that the best things in life often come from the most unexpected moments, if we are only brave enough to let ourselves be carried away.